The woman didn't collapse when they shoved her into the dirt. She just fell to her knees, slow and deliberate, like she'd been carrying the weight of the world, and finally found a place to set it down. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, patched with fabric that didn't match, and her face was streaked with dust that had turned to mud in the tracks of her tears. Two children clung to her skirts, a boy no older than 6 and a girl who couldn't have been more than 4, both of them silent in that terrible way children get when they've learned that crying brings worse things than comfort. The crowd had gathered at the edge of town, where the road turned to prairie, and the last building was just a half-rotted livery stable that nobody used anymore. It was the kind of place where people dumped things they didn't want to look at. The woman's voice cracked when she spoke, raw and desperate, but she didn't look at the crowd. She looked at the children. "Take my babies," she said, and the words came out like they were tearing her apart from the inside. "Please, somebody, they ain't done nothing wrong, they're hungry, they need." Her voice broke completely. She pressed her forehead to the dirt, her whole body shaking. "Just take them, feed them, I don't care what happens to me." Nobody moved. The people standing there, maybe 20 of them, just watched like they were waiting for something to happen that would tell them what to do. A shopkeeper with his arms crossed. A woman holding a parasol even though the sun was setting. A pair of ranch hands who'd come into town for whiskey and found this instead. And then there was the cowboy. He stood at the back of the crowd, leaning against a hitching post with his hat pulled low, the kind of man who didn't draw attention but couldn't help being noticed anyway. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dust on his boots and a revolver on his hip that looked like it had been there so long it was part of him. His name was Jacob Mercer, though most people just called him Mercer, and he'd been riding through town on his way back to his ranch when he heard the shouting. He hadn't meant to stop, but something about the woman's voice made him pull his horse to the side and dismount. And now here he was, watching this scene unfold like a bad play where nobody knew their lines. The woman sobbed into the dirt. The children stood frozen beside her, their hands still clutching her dress. The boy's face was blank, like he'd already learned not to feel anything. The girl's eyes were wide and wet, but she didn't make a sound. One of the ranch hands spat into the dust. "Outlaw's woman," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Her man robbed the stage 3 weeks back. Killed a driver. Now the law's looking for him and she ain't got nowhere to go." "Our problem," the shopkeeper said. His voice was flat, almost bored. "She made her bed." The woman lifted her head just enough to look at them through the hair that had come loose from her braid. "I didn't know," she said, and her voice was so quiet it was almost lost in the wind. "I swear to God I didn't know what he was doing. I thought he was working. I thought," she choked on the words. "I just want my baby safe, that's all. You can hang me, I don't care, just don't let them starve." The woman with the parasol turned away, like looking at the scene too long might infect her with something. "If we help her, we're helping him," she said. "What if the law finds out? What if they think we're hiding outlaws?" "We ain't hiding nobody," the shopkeeper said. "We're just making sure she moves on. Let her take her brats and find somewhere else to beg." Mercer's jaw tightened. He didn't say anything yet, just watched the way the little girl's hand trembled where it gripped her mother's skirt. The boy had shifted slightly, putting himself between his mother and the crowd, like his small body could protect her from anything. The woman pressed her face back into the dirt, her shoulders heaving. "Please," she whispered, "please." And that's when Mercer pushed off the hitching post and stepped forward. The crowd turned to look at him, and for a moment nobody said anything. He walked slow, his boots crunching on the dry ground until he was standing between the woman and the people who wanted her gone. He didn't look at them. He looked down at her, at the way her hands were pressed flat against the earth like she was praying to it. Then he crouched down, his knees popping slightly, and spoke in a voice that was low and steady and had the kind of weight that made people listen. "Ma'am," he said, "look at me." She didn't move at first. Then slowly she lifted her head. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face streaked with dirt and tears, and there was something in her expression that was worse than fear. It was surrender, like she'd already decided she was dead and was just waiting for the world to catch up. Mercer met her gaze and held it. "You got family?" "Anywhere you can go," she shook her head, barely a movement. "Nobody," she whispered. "My folks are gone. His folks won't have nothing to do with me now. I got nothing. I got nobody." Mercer nodded once like he'd expected that answer. Then he stood up, turned to face the crowd, and said, "She's coming with me." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when people aren't sure they heard what they think they heard. The shopkeeper blinked. The woman with the parasol's mouth opened slightly. One of the ranch hands let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "The hell you say?" the shopkeeper finally said. Mercer didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "You heard me. She's coming with me, her and the kids." "You out of your damn mind," the ranch hand said, stepping forward. "You know who her husband is. You know what he done." "I know what she done," Mercer said, his voice still calm, still steady. "Which is nothing. Far as I can tell, she's just trying to keep her children alive." "She's an outlaw's wife," the woman with the parasol said, her voice sharp. "If you help her, you're making yourself complicit. The law will come looking." "Then let them look," Mercer said. He glanced down at the woman, then back at the crowd. "I got a ranch 15 miles west, got room, got food. These kids are starving, and I ain't about to stand here and watch it happen because everyone's too scared to do the right thing." The shopkeeper's face flushed red. "You think you're better than us? Think you're some kind of hero?" Mercer shook his head slowly. "No, I just think I'm a man who can't walk away from this." He turned back to the woman and held out his hand. She stared at it like it was something from a dream, something that couldn't be real. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, in a voice so small it was almost lost, she said, "Why?" Mercer's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened just slightly. "Because somebody did the same for me once," he said. "Long time ago, and I reckon it's time I paid that forward." The woman's face crumpled, and for a moment it looked like she might break apart completely. But then she reached up, her hand trembling, and took his. He pulled her to her feet, steady and sure, and then he looked down at the children. The boy was still staring at him with that blank, wary expression. The girl had buried her face in her mother's skirt. "You two got names?" Mercer asked. The boy hesitated, then nodded. "I'm Danny," he said quietly. "That's Ellie." "All right, Danny, Ellie." Mercer straightened up and looked at the crowd one more time. "We're leaving now. Anybody got a problem with that, you can take it up with me. But I'm telling you right now, you won't like how that conversation ends." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And after a long, tense moment, Mercer turned and started walking toward his horse, the woman and her children following close behind. The crowd watched them go, silent and still, until they disappeared into the gathering dusk. But this wasn't where the story started. Not really. To understand why Jacob Mercer made that choice, why he stepped forward when everyone else stepped back, you have to go back. Back to a time when he was the one on his knees in the dirt, and someone else was the one who reached down and pulled him up. Back to the ranch where he'd learned that kindness wasn't weakness, and that sometimes the hardest thing to do is also the only thing worth doing. Back to where it all began, 20 years earlier, when a boy with nothing met a man who had everything to lose and chose to lose it anyway. It was 1863, and the world was on fire. The war had torn the country in half, and even out here in the territories, you could feel the weight of it pressing down like a storm that wouldn't break. Jacob had been 12 years old, rail-thin and hollow-eyed, wandering alone through country that didn't care if he lived or died. His parents were gone, buried somewhere back in Missouri after the fever took them both in the same week. He had an uncle somewhere in Kansas, or so he'd been told, but Kansas was a long way off and he didn't know if the man was even alive. So he walked. Stole what he could, begged when he had to, and tried not to think about the fact that he was probably going to die out here, alone and forgotten. That's when he stumbled onto the Callahan Ranch. It wasn't much, just a small spread with a few head of cattle and a house that looked like it had been built by someone who didn't quite know what they were doing, but made it work anyway. Jacob had been planning to steal some food from the barn and move on, but he was so weak from hunger that he passed out in the hay, and that's where Thomas Callahan found him the next morning. Thomas was a big man, broad-shouldered and bearded, with hands that looked like they could break a man in half but were gentle when they shook Jacob awake. He didn't ask a lot of questions, just looked at the boy lying in his barn, took in the hollow cheeks and the torn clothes and the look of someone who'd been running for so long they didn't remember what it felt like to stop, and he said, "You hungry?" Jacob nodded, too tired to lie. Thomas helped him to his feet and led him to the house, where his wife Mary was cooking breakfast. She took one look at Jacob and her face went soft in a way that made something in his chest ache. and without a word, she set another plate at the table and filled it with eggs and bacon and biscuits that were still warm from the oven. Jacob ate like he was afraid the food might disappear, and Thomas and Mary just watched him quietly, not saying anything, not asking anything, just letting him be. When he was done, Thomas leaned back in his chair and said, "You got somewhere to be." Jacob shook his head. "You got people." Another shake. Thomas glanced at Mary, and something passed between them, some silent conversation that Jacob couldn't hear but could feel. Then Thomas looked back at him and said, "You can stay, long as you need. We got work that needs doing, and if you're willing to pull your weight, you got a place here." Jacob stared at him, waiting for the catch, for the part where it turned out this was a trick or a trap or something that would cost him more than he had. But it never came. Thomas just stood up, clapped him on the shoulder, and said, "Come on, I'll show you around." Jacob stayed for 6 years. He worked the ranch, learned how to rope and ride and fix a fence and deliver a calf and 100 other things that Thomas taught him with the kind of patient, steady kindness that Jacob had never known before. Mary treated him like he was hers, fed him and scolded him and mended his clothes and made sure he knew he was wanted. They never said they were his family, but they didn't have to. It was in the way Thomas showed him how to hold a rifle, in the way Mary hummed while she cooked, in the way they both made space for him at the table every night without ever making it feel like charity. And then, one day, Thomas got himself in trouble. There was a man in town, a rancher named Gideon Cross, who'd been trying to buy up all the small spreads in the area and didn't take kindly to people who said no. Thomas said no. Cross didn't like that. So he sent some men to make an example, and Thomas ended up in a fight that left one of Cross's men dead and Thomas facing a noose. The law didn't care that it had been self-defense. Cross had money and influence, and Thomas was just a small rancher who nobody important cared about. They arrested him, threw him in jail, and set a trial date that everyone knew was just a formality. Mary was frantic, begging anyone who would listen to help, but nobody would. They were all too scared of Cross, too worried about what would happen if they got on his bad side. And Jacob, 18 years old and desperate, rode to Cross's ranch in the middle of the night and did the only thing he could think of. He begged. He knelt in the dirt in front of Gideon Cross's porch and begged him to let Thomas go, offered to work for Cross for nothing, offered to leave and never come back, offered anything he could think of. And Cross just laughed at him, called him a fool, and told him to get off his property before he had him shot. Jacob rode back to the ranch that night feeling like something inside him had broken. But when he got there, Mary was waiting for him, and she took one look at his face and pulled him into a hug that made him feel like a child again. She didn't say it was okay. She didn't promise that everything would work out. She just held him, and when she finally let go, she said, "You did what you could. That's all anyone can ever do." 3 days later, a stranger rode into town. Nobody knew who he was or where he came from, but he walked into the sheriff's office with a stack of papers that proved Cross's men had been harassing Thomas, that the fight had been self-defense, that the whole thing was a setup. The charges were dropped. Thomas came home, and the stranger disappeared before anyone could ask him why he'd done it. Jacob never found out who the man was, but he never forgot what he'd learned in those weeks. That sometimes the world is cruel and unfair, and sometimes the only thing you can do is stand up anyway, even when it feels like it won't make a difference. That kindness isn't about what you get back. It's about what you give when you have nothing left to give. Thomas and Mary passed a few years later, both of them taken by the same fever that had claimed Jacob's parents, and they left the ranch to him in their will. He'd been working it ever since, alone but not lonely, carrying the lessons they'd taught him like a weight he was proud to bear. And now, riding through the twilight with a woman and 2 children following behind him on his horse, he felt like he was finally paying back a debt that could never really be repaid. The woman's name was Clara. She told him that on the ride back to the ranch, her voice still shaky but stronger now, like she was starting to believe she might actually survive this. Her husband's name had been William, and she'd loved him once back when he was just a man trying to make a life for them, before the desperation and the bad choices and the slow slide into something darker. She hadn't known he was robbing stages, hadn't known he was killing people. He told her he was working for a freight company, and she'd believed him because she wanted to, because the alternative was too terrible to think about. And then one day the law showed up at her door, told her William was dead, shot in a gunfight with a posse, and that she needed to get out of town before they decided she was guilty too. She'd been on the road for a week, trying to find work, trying to find help, but nobody wanted anything to do with the widow of a killer. The children had stopped talking after the third day. She'd given them what little food she had, gone hungry herself, and by the time she reached the town where Mercer found her, she was out of options and out of hope. "I thought if I could just get them somewhere safe," she said, her voice thick with tears she was trying not to shed. "I thought if I could just make sure they'd be okay, then it wouldn't matter what happened to me." Mercer didn't say anything, just kept riding, the reins loose in his hands. Danny was sitting in front of him, stiff and silent, while Clara held Ellie behind her on the horse they'd borrowed from the livery. The girl had fallen asleep against her mother's back, exhausted from crying. After a long silence, Mercer said, "You ever worked a ranch?" Clara shook her head. "No, I can cook, though, and clean, and I'm good with my hands. I can sew, mend clothes, whatever you need." "Good," Mercer said. "I can use the help. House is a mess. Cooking's not my strong suit." "You pull your weight, you and the kids can stay as long as you need." Clara's breath hitched, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "Why are you doing this?" Mercer was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, his voice was softer than it had been before. "Because somebody did it for me once," he said, "and because those kids deserve a chance." They reached the ranch just after full dark. It was a modest place, a house with a porch that sagged slightly on one side, a barn that had seen better days but was still solid, and a corral with a few horses dozing in the moonlight. Mercer helped Clara and the children down, showed them inside, and lit a lamp that cast warm, flickering light across a room that was sparse but clean. There was a table, a few chairs, a fireplace with a kettle hanging over cold ashes, and a shelf with a handful of books and a photograph in a simple wooden frame. Clara's eyes went to the photograph immediately. It showed a man and a woman standing in front of a house, their faces solemn but kind, and between them was a boy who looked like he was trying very hard not to smile. "That's Thomas and Mary," Mercer said quietly, "and me a long time ago." Clara looked at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, there was something other than fear in her eyes. It was understanding. "They saved you," she said. "It wasn't a question." Mercer nodded. "Yeah, they did." He showed her to a small room off the main house, a space that had once been a storage room but had a bed and a window and enough room for the children to sleep on blankets on the floor. Clara looked at it like it was a palace, and when she turned to thank him, the words got stuck in her throat and all she could do was nod, tears streaming down her face again. Mercer left her there, went back to the main room, and sat down at the table with a heaviness that went deeper than exhaustion. He knew what he'd done, knew that bringing Clara and her children here was going to bring trouble. The law might come looking. The town might turn on him. Hell, Clara's husband had friends, or at least people who'd worked with him, and they might decide that the widow knew things she wasn't supposed to know. But he also knew that he couldn't have done anything else. Not and still be able to look at himself in the mirror. Not and still be able to call himself the man Thomas and Mary had raised. He was about to blow out the lamp and get some sleep when he heard the sound of hoofbeats in the distance. His blood went cold. He stood up slowly, moved to the window, and looked out into the darkness. There were riders coming up the road, at least a dozen of them, their shapes barely visible in the moonlight. They were moving slow, deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. Mercer's hand went to the revolver on his hip, and he felt his pulse start to quicken. This wasn't good. This wasn't good at all. The riders stopped about 50 yards from the house, just far enough that he couldn't make out their faces. One of them dismounted. A big man with a wide-brimmed hat, and started walking toward the porch. Mercer stepped outside, the door creaking behind him, and stood at the top of the steps with his hand resting on the butt of his gun. The man stopped at the bottom of the steps, looked up at him, and said, "You Jacob Mercer?" "I am," Mercer said, his voice steady. "Who's asking?" "Name's Harlan Cross," the man said, and Mercer's stomach dropped. "You might have heard of my brother Gideon. He used to run things around here back before he died." Mercer had heard the name. Gideon Cross had passed a few years back, some kind of sickness, but his brother Harlan had taken over the family business and was just as ruthless, if not more. "What do you want?" Mercer asked. Harlan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you picked up some strays in town. Outlaw's widow and her brats. That true?" Mercer didn't answer right away. He just stared at Harlan, weighing his options, trying to figure out where this was going. "What if it is?" he finally said. Harlan's smile widened. "Then you and I got a problem. See, that outlaw William, he owed my brother money, a lot of money. And since he's dead, that debt falls to his widow. I'm here to collect." Mercer's jaw tightened. "She don't have anything." "Then I'll take the kids," Harlan said, his voice casual, like he was talking about livestock. "Sell them to someone who needs workers. That'll cover part of it. As for the rest, well, I'm sure we can work something out." Mercer's hand tightened on his gun, and for a moment the air between them was thick with the promise of violence. But then Harlan held up a hand, still smiling. "Easy now," he said. "I'm not here to start a fight. I'm here to make you an offer. You hand over the widow and the kids, and I'll forget you were ever involved. You don't, and well, things get messy. And I'd hate to see that happen to a man like you. Man who's got a reputation for being decent." Mercer didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at Harlan with an expression that could have been carved from stone. After a long moment, Harlan shrugged. "Think about it," he said. "I'll be back tomorrow at noon. You got until then to make the smart choice." He turned and walked back to his horse, mounted up, and the riders turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Mercer standing alone on the porch with his heart pounding in his chest. He stood there for a long time, staring out into the night, before he finally went back inside and closed the door. Clara was standing in the doorway to the small room, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I heard," she said. "I heard what he said." Mercer nodded slowly. "Yeah, you should give us up," she said, her voice shaking. "You should. I don't want you getting hurt because of us. I don't want—" "I'm not giving you up," Mercer said, his voice firm. "Not to him, not to anyone." Clara's face crumpled, and she pressed her hands to her mouth like she was trying to hold back a sob. "But he'll kill you," she whispered. "He'll kill all of us." Mercer looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "Maybe, but maybe not. Either way, I'm not backing down." He walked past her into the room where the children were sleeping and looked down at them. Danny was curled up on a blanket, his arm around Ellie, both of them breathing softly in the dim light. They looked so small, so fragile, and Mercer felt something twist in his chest. He thought about Thomas and Mary, about the way they'd taken him in when he had nothing, about the way they'd stood by him even when it cost them. He thought about the stranger who'd saved Thomas from the noose, about the way one act of kindness could ripple out and change everything. And he thought about the kind of man he wanted to be. The next morning, Mercer rode into town. He didn't tell Clara where he was going, just told her to keep the doors locked and the children inside, and then he saddled his horse and left before the sun was fully up. He went to the sheriff's office first, a small building at the edge of town with bars on the windows, and a man inside who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The sheriff's name was Aldrich, a wiry man in his 50s with a face like old leather and eyes that had seen too much. "Mercer," Aldrich said when he walked in, not sounding surprised, "figured I'd be seeing you." "You heard about Clara," Mercer said. It wasn't a question. Aldrich nodded. "Heard you took her in. Heard Harlan Cross is looking to collect on her husband's debt, and I'm guessing you're here to ask me to do something about it." "I'm here to ask you to do your job," Mercer said. "Clara didn't do anything wrong. She's not responsible for her husband's debts, and she sure as hell doesn't deserve to have her children sold off to pay them." Aldrich sighed and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face. "You're right," he said. "But Harlan Cross don't care about right. He cares about money and power, and he's got enough of both that the law don't touch him. I go after him, I lose my job, or worse." "So you're just going to let him do whatever he wants?" Mercer said, his voice hard. Aldrich looked at him, and there was something tired and sad in his eyes. "I'm saying I can't stop him, not alone, and nobody else in this town is going to stand up to him either. You know that." Mercer stared at him for a long moment, and then he turned and walked out without another word. He went to the general store next, to the saloon, to the church, talking to anyone who would listen, trying to find someone, anyone who would stand with him. But everywhere he went, the answer was the same. People were scared. People had families. People had businesses, and Harlan Cross was the kind of man who didn't forget a slight. By the time the sun was high in the sky, Mercer was standing alone in the middle of the street, and he knew that when noon came it was going to be just him against Harlan and his men. He thought about running, thought about taking Clara and the children and heading west as far as they could go and hoping Cross wouldn't follow. But he knew that wasn't going to work. Men like Harlan didn't let things go. They hunted. They found you. And when they did, it was worse than if you'd stood your ground in the first place. So Mercer rode back to the ranch, checked his guns, and waited. Noon came, and so did Harlan Cross. This time there were more riders, maybe 20 of them, and they spread out in a half circle around the house like they were getting ready for a siege. Harlan dismounted again, walked up to the porch, and looked at Mercer with an expression that was almost amused. "Well," he said, "you thought about my offer." "I did," Mercer said. "And my answer's no." Harlan's smile faded. "That's a shame," he said. "I really didn't want this to get ugly." "Then leave," Mercer said. "Turn around, ride out, and don't come back." Harlan laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You got a lot of nerve, Mercer, I'll give you that, but nerve ain't going to save you. You're one man, I got 20. You really think you're going to stop me?" "I don't know," Mercer said, "but I'm sure as hell going to try." Harlan's expression darkened, and he took a step forward. "Last chance," he said. "Give me the widow and the kids, or I take them. And I take this ranch too, just for making me waste my time." Mercer's hand went to his gun, and for a moment it looked like the whole thing was about to explode into violence. But then the door behind Mercer opened, and Clara stepped out onto the porch. She was holding Danny's hand, and Ellie was clinging to her skirt, and her face was pale but determined. "Stop," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Just stop. I'll go with you. Just don't hurt them. Don't hurt him." Harlan's smile came back, slow and mean. "Now that's more like it," he said. Mercer turned to her, his voice low and urgent. "Clara, get back inside." "No," she said, and there were tears streaming down her face, but her eyes were steady. "I can't let you die for me. I can't. I'll go with him. I'll do whatever he wants. Just please don't." "Clara," Mercer said again, and this time his voice was softer. "Get back inside." She shook her head, and Harlan started laughing again. "Hell of a woman you got there, Mercer. Shame you're too stubborn to see sense." And that's when the first shot rang out. It didn't come from Harlan's men. It didn't come from Mercer. It came from the road behind them, and it kicked up dust right in front of Harlan's horse, making the animal rear and stumble. Harlan spun around, his hand going to his gun, and the riders scattered, pulling their horses back as more shots followed, precise and deliberate. None of them hitting anyone, but all of them close enough to make it clear that whoever was shooting knew what they were doing. Mercer's heart was pounding as he looked toward the road, and what he saw made him go still. There were riders coming, at least 30 of them, maybe more, and they were moving fast. At first he thought it was another gang, more of Cross's men, but then he saw the faces and the way they rode, and he realized with a jolt of shock that they weren't outlaws. They were townspeople. The sheriff was at the front, his face grim, his rifle in his hands. Behind him were the shopkeeper, the ranch hands, the woman with the parasol, and dozens of others, all of them armed, all of them riding hard toward the ranch. They pulled up in a line between Harlan's men and the house, and Aldrich leveled his rifle at Harlan with an expression that said he was done being scared. "That's enough, Cross," Aldrich said. "You're done here." Harlan stared at him, his face twisted with rage. "You got no right." "I got every right," Aldrich said. "You're threatening innocent people, you're trying to take children, and I'm not going to stand by and let it happen. None of us are." The shopkeeper raised his rifle too, and then the ranch hands, and one by one the rest of the townspeople followed, until Harlan was staring down the barrels of 30 guns and the smile was completely gone from his face. For a long moment nobody moved. The tension was so thick it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. And then slowly Harlan raised his hands. "All right," he said, his voice tight. "All right, we're leaving." "Good," Aldrich said. "And if I see you around here again, I'll shoot you myself. That clear?" Harlan didn't answer, just turned and walked back to his horse, mounted up and jerked the reins hard. His men followed, and they rode off into the distance, leaving nothing behind but dust and the memory of what almost happened. The townspeople stayed until they were out of sight, and then Aldrich dismounted and walked up to the porch. He looked at Mercer, and there was something in his eyes that might have been respect or maybe just exhaustion. "You're a damn fool, Mercer," he said. "But you're a decent fool." Mercer let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "What changed your mind?" Aldrich glanced back at the people behind him and then at Clara and the children. "Saw you ride into town this morning," he said. "Saw you asking people for help, and it got me thinking about what kind of man I want to be, what kind of town this is." He paused, then added, "And then Mary Hutchins came to my office and told me she'd be damned if she let a woman and 2 children get sold off like cattle while she stood by and did nothing. Said if I didn't do something, she'd get the whole town to vote me out. So, well, here we are." Mercer looked past him at the woman with the parasol, who was still sitting on her horse, her face flushed and her jaw set. She met his eyes and gave him a small, almost embarrassed nod. "Thank you," Mercer said, and his voice was rough with emotion he didn't know how to name. Aldrich just shrugged. "Don't thank me yet. Cross is going to be angry and he's got a long memory. You watch yourself." "I will," Mercer said. Aldrich nodded, tipped his hat, and walked back to his horse. The townspeople followed, and soon the ranch was quiet again, just Mercer and Clara and the children standing on the porch in the fading light. Clara was crying, her hands over her face, her whole body shaking with sobs that sounded like they'd been building for a long time. Danny was staring at Mercer with wide eyes, like he was trying to understand what had just happened, and Ellie was clutching her mother's skirt so tightly her knuckles were white. Mercer crouched down in front of Danny, looked him in the eye, and said, "You're safe now, all of you. Nobody's going to hurt you. You understand?" Danny nodded slowly, and then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, he said, "Why'd you do it?" Mercer thought about that for a moment, thought about Thomas and Mary and the stranger who'd saved them and the way kindness could ripple out and change the world in ways you couldn't predict. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said. "And it was. It really was. The years that followed weren't easy, but they were good." Clara stayed on at the ranch, and she and the children became part of the fabric of Mercer's life in a way he hadn't expected. She cooked and cleaned and kept the house running, and in return Mercer made sure they had everything they needed. Danny grew up strong and capable, learning the ranch work with the same quiet determination his mother had, and Ellie turned into a bright, laughing girl who filled the house with a kind of light it had been missing for a long time. People in town stopped treating Clara like an outlaw's widow and started treating her like a person, and slowly, carefully, she began to heal. She never remarried, never seemed to want to, but she found a kind of peace in the work and the routine, and the knowledge that her children were safe. Harlan Cross never came back. Rumor had it he'd moved on to other schemes, other towns, but Mercer kept a wary eye on the horizon just in case. And sometimes, late at night, he'd sit on the porch and think about the day he'd stepped forward in that crowd, the day he'd chosen to do the hard thing instead of the easy thing. He thought about Thomas and Mary, about the way they'd taught him that kindness wasn't about what you got back, but about what you gave when you had nothing left to give. He thought about the stranger who'd saved Thomas and the way one act of courage could change everything. And he thought about the fact that he'd almost walked away. Almost kept riding. Almost let Clara and her children disappear into the dust because it was safer, easier, less complicated. But he hadn't. He'd stopped. He'd stepped forward. And that, he thought, made all the difference. One evening, when the sun was setting and the sky was painted in shades of orange and gold, Danny came out onto the porch and sat down beside him. The boy was 14 now, tall and lean, with his mother's eyes and a quiet strength that reminded Mercer of himself at that age. "Can I ask you something?" Danny said. "Sure," Mercer said. Danny was quiet for a moment, staring out at the horizon. Then he said, "Do you ever regret it taking us in?" Mercer looked at him, surprised. "No," he said. "Never." "Why?" Danny shrugged, but there was something heavy in the gesture. "Just seems like we caused you a lot of trouble. Seems like things would have been easier if you just kept riding." Mercer was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Maybe, but easier ain't always better." Danny looked at him, and Mercer went on. "When I was about your age, a man named Thomas Callahan took me in. Gave me a home when I didn't have one. Taught me how to work, how to live, how to be a decent human being. And he did it even though it wasn't easy, even though it brought him trouble, because he believed it was the right thing to do." Mercer paused, then added, He taught me that the measure of a man isn't what he does when it's easy, it's what he does when it's hard, and I've tried to live by that ever since. Danny nodded slowly, and after a moment he said, I want to be like that, like you. Mercer felt something tighten in his chest, something warm and painful and good all at once. You already are, kid, he said. You already are. They sat there in silence as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to come out, one by one, filling the sky with light. And Mercer thought about the fact that kindness wasn't a single act. It was a choice you made over and over again, every day, even when it was hard, even when it cost you something. It was standing up when everyone else sat down. It was reaching out when everyone else pulled back. It was believing, even in the face of everything, that people were worth saving. Clara stepped out onto the porch, a cup of coffee in her hands, and she handed it to Mercer with a small smile. Thank you, she said, and she didn't need to say for what. He knew. Mercer took the coffee, nodded, and said, You're welcome. And as the night settled in around them, warm and quiet and full of the kind of peace that only comes from knowing you've done the right thing, Jacob Mercer thought about the boy he'd been and the man he'd become, and he felt something close to contentment. Because in the end, that's all any of us can really hope for. To make the world a little bit better, to help someone who needs it, to stand up when it matters, and to know when the dust settles and the sun sets that we did what we could with what we had, that we chose kindness over cruelty, courage over fear, and hope over despair, that we were, in the end, decent. And that, Mercer thought, was enough.